There's a particular kind of frustration that comes from giving someone good advice and watching them ignore it completely. And if you've felt that frustration, you've probably also wondered, what is wrong with them? But that question assumes the problem is with the person who didn't take the advice. The psychology suggests otherwise. People who dislike receiving advice aren't broken or difficult by default. In many cases, they're operating from a set of psychological traits that are more coherent and more considered than the assumption of stubbornness allows. And understanding those traits changes the picture significantly. Let's start with the most fundamental one. These people have a high need for autonomy, not in the casual sense of liking to do things their own way, but in the more precise psychological sense described by self-determination theory. The deep-seated need to feel that the choices shaping their life are genuinely their own, made from their own values and their own reasoning rather than in response to external direction. For people with a strong autonomy drive, unsolicited advice doesn't land as care. It lands as interference. Not because they've misread the intention, they often understand perfectly well that the person advising them means well. But the experience of being advised, regardless of the content, carries an implicit message. You need to be pointed in a direction. And that message, however kindly delivered, runs directly against something fundamental in how they relate to their own decision-making. Psychologists call the reaction that follows psychological reactance, a well-documented phenomenon in which people resist influence not because the influence is wrong, but because the act of being influenced threatens their sense of freedom. Research on reactance has found that it operates largely automatically. When someone's sense of autonomy is threatened, they push back, often before they've even evaluated whether the advice is good or not. The quality of the advice is almost beside the point. The interference is the problem. This is an important distinction. These people are not resisting information. They consume information constantly, often more deliberately and more selectively than average. What they resist is the directional pressure that advice typically carries, the implicit expectation that they should now incorporate someone else's judgment into their decision-making process. That pressure, unsolicited, is what they're pushing against. The second trait goes deeper and explains why the resistance isn't simply defensiveness. People who dislike receiving advice typically have a well-developed internal decision-making system. Over time, through experience, reflection, and careful attention to outcomes, they've built a process they trust, a way of gathering relevant information, weighing it against their own values and circumstances, and arriving at conclusions that hold up. That system works. They know it works because they've tested it repeatedly. When advice arrives from outside, it doesn't slot neatly into that system. It arrives as an unsolicited input into a process that wasn't waiting for it, a process that is often already underway, already incorporating the relevant considerations, already moving toward a conclusion. The advice doesn't simplify the process. It complicates it. Now they have to evaluate the advice itself, assess the source, consider the motivation, judge the relevance to their specific situation, and decide whether it merits being integrated into their thinking or set aside. That's cognitive work they didn't ask for. Psychologists who study decision-making have found that people with strong internal reasoning processes often experience unsolicited advice as an increase in cognitive load rather than a reduction in it. For most people, advice is labor-saving. Someone else has done some of the thinking for you. For people with a functioning internal system, it's the opposite. Someone has just added to the thinking they were already doing, without understanding what they were already doing. This doesn't mean they're closed to input. It means they're selective about it. They seek out perspectives when they've identified a specific gap in their thinking. They ask questions when they've reached a point where outside information would actually be useful. The difference is that they control when the input arrives and how it's incorporated, and advice that bypasses that control doesn't work with their process. It works against it. The third trait is the most practically grounded, and for many of these people, it's the one that formed earliest. They've learned, through accumulated experience, that most advice is given with incomplete information. And incomplete information produces advice that sounds reasonable but doesn't actually fit. Think about what the person advising you actually knows. They know what you've told them, the version of the situation you've described. filtered through what you thought was relevant, what you were comfortable sharing, and what came to mind in the moment. They don't know the full history. They don't know the constraints you haven't mentioned, the things you've already tried, the factors you've decided not to explain because it would take too long or feel too personal. They don't know the actual priorities you're working with, which often differ from the stated ones. And they don't know the specific texture of your situation, the particular combination of circumstances that makes it different from the superficially similar situations they're mapping onto it. Psychologists who study advisory relationships describe a consistent pattern they call perspective projection, the tendency of advisors to apply their own frameworks, assumptions, and past experiences to someone else's situation without fully accounting for how different that situation actually is. It's not malicious. It's an almost unavoidable feature of trying to help from the outside. But the result is advice that fits the advisor's mental model of the situation rather than the situation itself. People who dislike advice have often been on the receiving end of this enough times to recognize the pattern clearly. They've followed advice that was given confidently and watched it fail in ways the advisor didn't anticipate because the advisor didn't have the full picture. They've heard suggestions that would have made perfect sense for a different version of their circumstances. And over time, they've updated their prior. Advice from someone who doesn't fully understand the situation is rarely as useful as it sounds. This isn't cynicism. It's calibration. They're not assuming the person advising them is wrong or ill-intentioned. They're simply applying an accurate probability estimate to how likely unsolicited advice, given without complete information, is to actually improve on what they would have arrived at on their own. And for people who know their own situations deeply and think carefully about their own decisions, that probability is often lower than the advisor assumes. There is one more thing worth saying about what these people actually look like when they do seek advice, because it clarifies the psychology considerably. When someone who generally dislikes advice asks for it, the request is almost always specific. Not, "What do you think I should do?" but, "I'm trying to decide between these two things. Do you have experience with either?" Not a general invitation to weigh in, but a targeted question that fits a gap they've already identified in their own thinking. They've done the work. They've located the specific place where outside input would actually be useful. And then they go and get exactly that input from someone whose experience is relevant at a moment when they can actually use it. That's not resistance to advice. That's a more deliberate and more efficient relationship with advice than most people manage. So let's be clear about who these people are. They are not arrogant. They are not closed to learning. They are not people who think they already know everything. They are people who have built something real, a way of thinking about their own lives that works, and who have learned to be careful about what they let into that process and on whose terms. In a world that produces unsolicited advice at a remarkable volume, from family, from friends, from social media, from anyone who has a passing familiarity with a corner of your situation, that carefulness is not a flaw. It's a form of self-knowledge acted on. The people who resist advice aren't closed minds. They're minds that have learned to be careful about what they let in. If that resonated, leave a comment. I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'll see you in the next video.